In a quiet corner of the University of Pennsylvania Museum, beneath the cool lighting of its Babylonian section, rests a clay tablet known simply as CBS 2204. At first glance, it might seem unremarkable, just another weathered relic among thousands unearthed from the ancient temple library of Nippur in present-day southern Iraq. Yet, this particular artifact, etched with wedge-shaped cuneiform script, has ignited fierce debates among historians, archaeologists, and theologians alike. Because CBS 2204 doesn't merely recount the religious rites or commercial records typical of Mesopotamian tablets, it describes, in hauntingly specific detail, the annihilation of cities, not symbolic ruin, but obliteration by forces the scribes struggle to describe. It speaks of divine decrees, weapons from above, of fire and wind so fierce it turned earth into glass, and salted the soil so thoroughly that no crops would grow for generations. For decades, scholars interpreted these descriptions as metaphor, poetic laments for military defeats. But recent discoveries in the Jordan Valley have challenged that assumption and forced a re-examination of what these ancient texts were truly recording. The words on the tablet form part of a genre now recognized as city laments, a literary form unique to ancient Sumer, composed around 2000 BCE. These laments mourn the destruction of major urban centers like Eridu, Nippur, and others. They told of gods abandoning temples, of fire raining from the sky, of desolation so profound, coating fields, homes, and bodies with crystallized. They described winds that poisoned the arid land that refused to yield food. It was a genre soaked in grief, yet constructed with forensic clarity, as if the scribes wanted future generations not just to mourn, but to understand. When first translated, scholars like Samuel Noah Kramer assumed these were dramatizations, religious allegories about divine punishment. After all, Bronze Age cities fell often to invaders, famine, drought. The gods were always involved in Mesopotamian storytelling. But one line continued to trouble careful readers, the mention of weapons from above. Not metaphorical wrath, but something literal, something seen, remembered, feared. The language of the tablet is clinical in its depictions. It does not speak in riddles. It tells of storm and fire descending from the heavens, of temperatures so high they melted bricks and vitrified pottery. It tells of farmland rendered sterile not by neglect, but by a rain of salt that poisoned the earth. The descriptions include cities whose roofs burned first, fire beginning at the top,
from beyond Earth,
not spreading upward.
reminding us that
And
such
they mention a
events have
divine
struck
council where
repeatedly
destruction
across
was not
history.
chaotic, but decreed. This last detail struck many as particularly strange. The gods in Sumerian literature were not usually arbitrary. They debated, they voted, they issued proclamations. The idea that a divine council would gather to decide the fate of multiple cities in a single stroke evokes an unsettling parallel with something more deliberate than natural disaster. And yet, for centuries, there was no physical evidence to support these dramatic accounts, until archaeologists began uncovering something extraordinary near the Dead Sea. If the tablet had remained an isolated account, disconnected from any physical reality, perhaps it would still be relegated to theological study and academic debate. But the real-world counterpart to its laments may have emerged from the sands of the Jordan Valley, in a place now called Tal el-Hammam. This site, northeast of the Dead Sea, held layers of urban history stretching back thousands of years. But beneath those layers was something else, 1.5 meters of destruction. Ash, melted mud bricks, disintegrated human remains, pottery that had bubbled like glass, clay that had flowed like lava, bone fragments scattered and charred as if a great furnace had passed through. These weren't signs of slow decline or war. They spoke of something instantaneous, violent, and all-consuming. Something that, in terms the ancient Sumerians might have understood, came from the sky. There's something eerily intimate about the way the scribes of CBS 2204 conveyed their message. They didn't write for kings or for future glory. They wrote for memory. There is an unmistakable urgency in their lines, a pleading voice that seems to whisper across time, "May this not happen again. Let it be remembered." These weren't just scribes. They were witnesses. And the story they etched into clay did not fade. It passed through millennia, surviving conquest, flood, and forgetfulness. And now, it sits under glass, still speaking, still warning. What was once dismissed as religious metaphor now echoes uncomfortably close to archaeological truth, whether coincidence or confirmation. The resonance is undeniable. The same patterns, the same language, are reappearing in excavation reports and scientific papers. If you've made it this far, you're clearly among the few who feel that chill, that sense that something ancient is still reaching for us. So, now I have a request. Before we dig deeper into this mystery, take a moment. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, so you don't miss what comes next. Leave a comment and tell me, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it? Is it midnight? Are you drifting into sleep as this ancient whisper follows you? And if this story is resonating, if you feel you now understand the strange warning in the title, share the video with someone who needs to hear it too. Let the message reach further, just as the scribes intended. Some readers may feel skeptical. After all, mythology and history often intertwine. Catastrophes are given divine meaning. Heroes become gods. Metaphors abound. But the laments of the Sumerians are different. They are not interested in celebrating conquest or divine glory. They are filled with sorrow. They catalog damage. They record logistics, dates, cities, consequences. And when placed alongside the physical evidence emerging from Tal el-Hammam and surrounding sites, the question becomes inescapable. Could these texts be describing the same event from different cultural perspectives? Could what Genesis calls divine judgment and the Sumerians call divine decree be, in fact, eyewitness accounts of the same shared trauma, rendered through the vocabularies available to ancient people trying to make sense of incomprehensible violence? The weight of this possibility lies not just in historical curiosity, but in something far more human. If these records are more than poetry, if they are documentation, then the voices of those who perished in ancient fires are still speaking. Their cities are dust, their names forgotten, but their grief remains, pressed into clay and now into our consciousness. That's the enduring power of CBS 2204. It is not just a tablet, it is a warning, a memory, a bridge between their world and ours. One that says, as clearly as it can, this happened. Remember us. Don't let it happen again. In the northeastern corner of the Dead Sea lies a desolate expanse of rubble and sand known today as Tal el-Hammam. For centuries, it was little more than a forgotten mound, an unremarkable bump on the Jordanian landscape. But beginning in the early 2000s, a series of archaeological excavations transformed this quiet site into the center of one of the most dramatic scientific and theological debates of the century. What researchers uncovered there was not just another Bronze Age city, but a site frozen in the moment of its destruction, a destruction so sudden, so violent, and so complete that its scars are still visible in the soil and the shattered bones beneath it. And from these ruins rose a possibility so bold that many rejected it outright, that this city might be the real Sodom. It started with pottery. Thousands of shards lay buried in the debris field, but they were strange. Their outer surfaces had melted into glossy, bubbled forms, while their interiors remained intact. It was as if the ceramic had been exposed to a blast of fire, hotter than any kiln in the Bronze Age could generate. Heating experiments later showed that some pieces must have been exposed to temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius, far beyond the capabilities of any ancient furnace, forge, or fire. Even modern industrial methods struggle to reach such heat without controlled conditions. More puzzling still, the transition between the melted exterior and untouched interior occurred within millimeters, suggesting not a prolonged burn, but an instantaneous thermal pulse, one of immense intensity and extraordinary brevity. The buildings told a similar story. In the upper city, archaeologists discovered walls that had collapsed inward and downward as if crushed from above. Mud brick, the primary building material of the time, had been vitrified, its surfaces fused into ceramic-like material. Some fragments had dripped, as if partially liquefied before cooling. Roofing materials had flowed like lava through broken beams, forming hardened stalactites. What fire or furnace could reduce an entire city to slag in a matter of seconds? The answer, many began to suspect, was none. not a fire from Earth, but from the sky. Human remains deepened the mystery. Rather than complete skeletons, researchers uncovered a haunting pattern. Bones shattered into fragments, scattered across rooms, often disarticulated and burnt. Forensic analysis indicated that the damage occurred at the moment of death, not through later decay or scavenging. Victims had been torn apart by immense forces, limbs separated from torsos, skulls shattered into splinters. There were no signs of disease or prolonged starvation, no siege, no warfare. This was not the slow rot of decline. It was annihilation in an instant, like pressing pause at the precise moment a city ceased to be. Among the team leading the excavation was Dr. Stephen Collins, whose belief that this site could be linked to biblical Sodom had guided years of methodical digging. He was joined by Dr. James Kennett, a geologist and expert in cosmic impact events. Together, they examined the sediment layers beneath Tal el Hammam's destruction. What they found resembled not just disaster, but detonation. Microscopic spherules of iron and silica, tiny beads formed when rock is vaporized and cools while suspended in air, were abundant in the soil. There were also elevated traces of iridium and platinum, elements rare on Earth but common in meteorites. And then there was the salt. Massive concentrations of salt were found across the site, so much that in some areas, nearly a quarter of the sediment was composed of it. These weren't natural salt beds drawn up from deep deposits, but airborne material. Flung and scattered over a wide area, chemical analysis showed that the salt particles were consistent with evaporated Dead Sea water. The destruction layer seemed to have been coated with it, as though brine had exploded into the air and rained down upon the city. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just a fire, it was an event with thermal, chemical, and mechanical impacts consistent with an aerial explosion, what scientists call an airburst. The evidence pointed to a single hypothesis. A cosmic object, perhaps a meteor or comet fragment, had exploded above the city with titanic force, unleashing a shockwave and a burst of thermal radiation similar to a nuclear detonation. The mechanism mirrors the infamous Tunguska event of 1908, when a meteor exploded over Siberia, flattening over 2,000 square kilometers of forest without leaving a crater. The Tunguska object is estimated to have released the energy of 1,000 Hiroshima bombs. What happened at Tal el Hammam might have been comparable. In 2021, the research team published their findings in the journal Scientific Reports, a reputable branch of the Nature family. The article detailed the physical and chemical evidence, melted materials, high-temperature signatures, shocked quartz, unusual elemental ratios. The team argued that only an airburst event could account for the data. It was a bold claim, and the paper went viral, stirring both excitement and backlash. Within months, critics began challenging the findings, especially the identification of shocked quartz, a mineral signature considered a smoking gun of cosmic impacts. Skeptics argued that the microfractures observed weren't definitive, and that simpler geological processes might explain them. By 2025, Nature retracted the paper, citing methodological flaws. Yet the retraction didn't erase the data, only the certainty of interpretation. The melted pottery was still real, the destruction layer still unmistakable, the salted soil still toxic, the disarticulated bones still silent witnesses to a moment of utter obliteration. The critics had raised valid questions, but no one had offered a more convincing alternative. The cause remained unknown. The destruction remained undeniable. What strikes researchers most is the concentrated devastation. Airbursts typically cover wide areas, but the blast at Tal el Hammam seems to have targeted a narrow corridor. Within a radius of 25 kilometers, over 20 settlements were simultaneously abandoned around 1650 BCE. Not slowly, not over centuries, but all at once. This suggests not random impact, but chilling precision. Cities destroyed while others just beyond the threshold survived. The pattern is difficult to explain with natural processes alone, and it aligns, disturbingly well, with ancient texts describing divine punishment focused on 5 cities of the plain. As Dr. Collins has argued, the physical evidence at Tal el Hammam does not just suggest catastrophe, it suggests a catastrophe remembered, one so searing it etched itself into regional folklore, into sacred texts, into the DNA of myth itself. When Genesis speaks of burning sulfur from the heavens, when Abraham sees smoke rising like a furnace, it's easy to dismiss these as religious metaphor. But what if they're not? What if they're descriptions of something real, something so devastating it left scars not only in the earth, but in memory? The ruins of Tal el-Hammam are more than stone and clay. They are a frozen moment, a photograph in ash, a black box recording of a Bronze Age apocalypse. Whatever happened here, it was beyond the capabilities of human armies. No siege weapon melts pottery. No ancient army spreads salt through the air. No conventional fire turns a palace into lava. And yet, here it is, evidence that something terrible happened, something unlike anything else in the archaeological record of the Levant, whether from the heavens or something else entirely. Tal el-Hammam stands as one of the most compelling and unsettling mysteries in ancient history, a city turned to glass and dust in the blink of an eye, and a question left echoing through the ages. What kind of fire fell from that sky? The phenomenon known as a cosmic airburst is one of nature's most violent secrets, silent until the moment of devastation, a celestial ambush that transforms the sky into a weapon. No warning, no crater, no lasting monument beyond melted rock and scattered bones, just a moment of searing light, a concussive wave, and then silence. That, many believe, is what happened at Tal el-Hammam around 1650 BCE. A moment when the atmosphere itself ignited above the city, raining devastation downward and changing the course of history in an instant. And the more researchers studied the evidence, the more they began to see patterns that mirrored another catastrophic event. This time, one that happened in modern times. On the morning of June 30th, 1908, a fireball tore through the skies above Siberia. Witnesses hundreds of miles away reported a blinding flash, a series of deafening booms, and shock waves that shattered windows. Trees were flattened across 2,000 square kilometers, their trunks charred and pointing away from a central blast zone. Yet, when scientists finally reached the site, they found no crater. Nothing had touched the ground. The object, likely a meteor around 50 meters in diameter, had exploded mid-air, releasing energy equivalent to 1,000 Hiroshima bombs. That explosion, known today as the Tunguska event, became the blueprint for understanding cosmic airbursts. It was not until researchers began analyzing Tal el-Hammam that they realized they might be looking at an ancient echo of the same celestial violence. At Tal el-Hammam, the telltale signs were all there: directional debris fields, high-temperature damage, the presence of microspherules, and melted surfaces consistent with brief but intense exposure to heat. Shocked quartz grains, if conclusively identified, would further seal the case, as they only form under pressures created by powerful impacts or explosions. When these minerals fracture in very specific ways, it suggests a force far greater than anything produced by ancient human activity. It suggests the sky itself tore open. But what made the Tal el-Hammam event even more compelling was the sheer range of anomalies. Salt deposits reaching 25% in some layers of sediment, vitrified mud brick and pottery with glass-like exteriors but intact interiors, human remains fragmented in ways consistent with explosive trauma. These clues pointed not just to fire, but to thermal and mechanical forces unleashed almost simultaneously. For many scientists, the only phenomenon capable of producing this combination is an airburst. The Nature Scientific Reports paper, published in 2021, was the first major academic attempt to synthesize all the evidence. It proposed a model, a cosmic object, roughly 50 meters wide, entered Earth's atmosphere over the Jordan Valley at high velocity, estimated at 60,000 kilometers per hour, at an altitude of about 20 to 30 kilometers. The object exploded, creating a downward-facing shock wave of searing plasma and hypervelocity wind. The surface temperatures spiked to over 2,000 degrees Celsius for less than a second. The air compressed, then expanded violently. Buildings collapsed inward. Bodies were torn apart. Pottery melted. Salt-laden water from the Dead Sea may have been vaporized and rained down, salting the earth. Then came the silence. For a moment, the academic world seemed stunned. The parallels to Tunguska were undeniable. The scale of the destruction was immense, and the location, so close to where the Bible places Sodom, was almost too perfect. But with attention came scrutiny. Scientists, particularly in the fields of mineralogy and impact geology, began combing through the data. Their critiques centered on the identification of shocked quartz, which requires extremely precise confirmation. Some argued that the fractures described by the Tal El Hammam team were not planar enough, or were inconsistent with genuine impact deformation. Others suggested that high-temperature phenomena could result from more mundane causes, intense fires, ancient metallurgy, or even lightning strikes. By April 2025, under mounting pressure, the journal retracted the original article, not because the findings were proven false, but because the methodology used to identify key minerals was deemed insufficiently rigorous. The retraction was not an accusation of fraud, but a call for greater precision. Still, in the minds of many, the damage was done. The sensational theory of an ancient airburst had lost its peer-reviewed foundation. But while the paper was withdrawn, the evidence itself remained. The melted pottery was still real, the bone fragmentation still unexplained, the vitrified structures still standing. The question now was not whether the event happened, but what exactly caused it. Some researchers, despite the controversy, continued to argue in favor of the airburst theory. They pointed out that even without the contested quartz data, the overall picture still supported an extraordinary, high-energy event. The scale and speed of the destruction, the geographical concentration of damage, the high salt content, these were not easily explained by normal fire or warfare. Airbursts don't leave craters, but they leave patterns. Directional blast zones, thermal exposure gradients, material ejection profiles. The data from Tal El Hammam matched those patterns with eerie precision, yet others remained cautious. Extraordinary claims, they argued, require extraordinary evidence. If a cosmic airburst really destroyed a Bronze Age city, then similar events should leave similar signatures elsewhere. And while the Earth has seen its share of craters and impact sites, confirmed ancient airbursts, especially ones of this magnitude, are still rare in the archaeological record. Skeptics asked, could there be another explanation? That's where the story begins to blur. If not a cosmic event, what could account for destruction on this scale? Volcanoes leave ash. Earthquakes collapse structures, but don't melt pottery. Warfare, at least with Bronze Age tools, doesn't vaporize rooftops. Could it have been a local industrial accident? Some kind of chemical explosion? Highly unlikely. Tal El Hammam was a thriving Bronze Age city, not a proto-nuclear lab. The only remaining explanations are either extremely rare natural phenomena or technologies beyond the capabilities of that era. And either one points towards something extraordinary. Regardless of the cause, the implications are profound. If Tal El Hammam was destroyed by an airburst, it may be the first known instance of such a cosmic disaster preserved in both the archaeological and literary record. A meteor strike so intense that it became myth, passed down as divine judgment, remembered as fire from heaven. It would make the biblical story of Sodom not just a moral parable, but a cultural memory of an actual disaster, a moment when the sky turned against the earth, and people watched their world end in fire. The debate over Tal El Hammam is far from settled. More studies are underway, more samples are being analyzed, new papers, cautious and conservative, are being drafted. But one thing is certain, something happened there. Something powerful enough to flatten walls, melt clay, fragment bones, and coat the land in salt. And, whatever that something was, it came not from beneath, but from above. Long before archaeologists arrived at Tal El Hammam with ground-penetrating radar and carbon-dating tools, the story of the city's destruction had already been told, etched not in soil, but in Scripture. In Genesis chapter 19, the Bible offers a vivid account of divine judgment upon two infamous cities, Sodom and Gomorrah. It describes a scene of terrifying clarity. The Lord rains down burning sulfur from the sky. Dense smoke rises from the valley like smoke from a furnace. Cities are obliterated. Survivors flee. A woman looks back and becomes a pillar of salt. For generations, this story was treated as allegory, a moral warning wrapped in myth. But as the physical evidence from Tal El Hammam accumulates, the parallels to the biblical narrative have become impossible to ignore. The geography described in Genesis aligns with startling precision. Sodom and Gomorrah were said to be located in the valley of Siddim, near the Dead Sea. Abraham, standing near Bethel, looked eastward across the Jordan Valley and saw the smoke rising from the land. Tall El Hammam sits on the eastern side of the Jordan, just northeast of the Dead Sea, on a high ridge that offers a panoramic view of the surrounding plain. From the area near ancient Bethel, modern Ramallah, this ridge is clearly visible. The location matches the account, not roughly, not vaguely, but exactly. Even the city's layout and scale lend credibility to its identification. Genesis implies that Sodom was a major city, a hub of trade and activity. Lot, Abraham's nephew, chose to live there because the region was well-watered, like the garden of the Lord. Archaeological surveys confirm that during the Middle Bronze Age, Tal el Hammam was the largest fortified city in the southern Levant. At its peak, the city spanned 36 hectares, with 4-story structures, massive defensive walls, and complex water systems. It was not a village. It was a metropolis, an urban center capable of supporting thousands, the kind of city whose sudden and complete destruction would be remembered for generations. Then there's the timing. While biblical chronology is notoriously difficult to align with the archaeological record, the traditional period for the patriarchs, including Abraham and Lot, is typically placed somewhere between 2000 and 1800 BCE. The destruction layer at Tal el Hammam dates to approximately 1650 BCE. The overlap, though not exact, falls within the wide margins of error common to both radiocarbon dating and biblical timelines. In ancient history, a gap of 100 years is often the blink of an eye. The nature of the destruction? 2 echoes Genesis. The text describes fire from the sky, brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. Abraham sees smoke rising like the smoke of a furnace. These aren't vague metaphors. They are precise images. Burning material falling from above, a pillar of smoke, widespread devastation. From a Bronze Age perspective, witnessing a cosmic airburst would have no frame of reference other than divine wrath. And in fact, that description, fire descending, smoke rising, land scorched, matches almost perfectly what modern scientists believe happened at Tal el Hammam. Perhaps the most chilling alignment is the salt. The Bible says Lot's wife looked back and was turned into a pillar of salt. Scholars have long puzzled over this detail. Why salt? Why not ash or stone? But the destruction layer at Tal el Hammam is riddled with salt, unnaturally high concentrations, spread across miles, coating the soil so thoroughly that agriculture was impossible for centuries. Some areas contained up to 25% salt in the sediment, salt that likely came from a vaporized Dead Sea, flung into the air and settled like toxic snow. If Lot's wife had turned back at the wrong moment, just as the airburst hit, she might have been caught in a blast of superheated brine and sediment. From the survivor's point of view, her sudden transformation would seem divine. Even Lot's escape route fits. According to Genesis, he fled to Zoar, a small town spared from the destruction. Scholars have identified possible locations for Zoar further south along the Jordan, within walking distance from Tal el Hammam. More significantly, the directionality of the destruction, based on the dispersion of debris and melt, suggests a southwest to northeast vector. Lot fled eastward, likely just outside the blast radius. Abraham, observing from the west, would have been upwind. The smoke he saw would have risen from the valley just as described. This raises a profound question. If the biblical account matches the archaeological evidence so closely, is it possible that the Genesis narrative preserves an eyewitness memory? Oral traditions are known to endure for centuries, even millennia. Details change, names evolve, but the core story of cities destroyed by fire from the sky, of survivors fleeing, of land left poisoned and empty, can survive in remarkably intact form, especially if the event was traumatic enough to brand itself into cultural memory. The Bible also mentions that the cities of the plain included not just Sodom and Gomorrah, but Admah, Zeboim, and Zoar. Archaeological surveys around Tal el-Hammam have identified at least 20 other settlements within a 25-kilometer radius that were all abandoned at the same time. Cities burned, populations vanished, the entire valley went quiet. The soil, salted and sterile, could no longer support life. This is not a story. It's a collapse. Even the cultural interpretation in Genesis reflects this trauma. Sodom and Gomorrah become symbols of sin and divine justice, invoked repeatedly throughout Scripture as warnings. But beneath the theology lies something more primal. Grief. The story of Lot's flight, of his wife's death, of Abraham's bargaining with God. All of it reads less like a morality tale and more like an attempt to make sense of horror. To explain why the world ended in fire one day. To remember, in sacred terms, what might otherwise have been lost. Critics argue that the identification of Tal el-Hammam with Sodom is speculative, that ancient names and locations are too fluid to draw such direct lines, but the convergence of geography, chronology, destruction, and memory is hard to ignore. There are other candidates for Sodom, sites like Bab ed-Dura further south, but they lack the scale, the directionality, and the alignment with the biblical travel narrative. From Bethel, you cannot see Bab ed-Dura, but you can see Tal el-Hammam. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, whether divine or cosmic, moral or natural, is no longer just the stuff of sermons and Sunday school. It is embedded in the earth, in the bones of a shattered city, in the melted walls and salted soil. What the Bible calls judgment, the archaeologist calls catastrophe, but the difference may be only in perspective. For the people who lived there, who woke one morning to a city of markets and laughter, and slept that night under silence and ash, it mattered little whether the fire came from God or sky. It came, and they never saw it coming. The book of Genesis doesn't speak only of Sodom and Gomorrah. It names 5 cities: Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Zoar, clustered together in a fertile valley near the Dead Sea. These were the so-called cities of the plain, described as prosperous, fertile, and full of life until the day divine judgment came. While Sodom and Gomorrah have dominated religious and cultural memory, the other 3 faded into obscurity. Their names mentioned only in passing in Scripture, their locations lost. For centuries, scholars and explorers assumed they were mythic constructs or simply misplaced names. But as the ruins of Tal el-Hammam began to give up their secrets, a new possibility emerged. What if the Bible's cities of the plain were real? And what if they were all destroyed in the same event? Tal el-Hammam, if indeed it is Sodom, was not isolated. Archaeologists working in the region have uncovered over 20 other Middle Bronze Age settlements within a 25-kilometer radius, all of which show signs of sudden abandonment around the same time, circa 1650 BCE. Some of these sites, like Tal Nimrin and Tal Kafrin, display similar destruction patterns: burned structures, disrupted stratigraphy, and pottery deformed by high heat. These were not minor villages. They were sizable urban centers, some fortified, some engaged in trade. Their collective disappearance represents not a slow migration or a shift in population patterns, but a catastrophic regional collapse. The physical evidence from these sites mirrors what was found at Tal el-Hammam: ash layers, melted materials, bone fragments, and most significantly, environmental degradation. Soil samples across the valley show elevated salt concentrations, enough to destroy agriculture and render the land uninhabitable for centuries. This salinization wasn't a natural process. It came suddenly, likely distributed by an airburst that vaporized part of the nearby Dead Sea and flung the salt across the region. Crops failed, wells turned bitter, and the people left. Some may have died in the initial blast. Others fled into the hills, but none returned. One of the more compelling aspects of this pattern is the synchronicity. Cities don't normally fall all at once. They fade. They're conquered. They suffer drought or disease. But in the Jordan Valley, we find a temporal cliff. Occupation layers stop abruptly across multiple sites. The pottery remains unfinished. Meals remain on hearths. It's the archaeological equivalent of a city frozen in the act of living, and then, nothing. A gap lasting 300 to 600 years. known to scholars as the Late Bronze Age Gap. It was a regional silence, as if the entire valley had been deemed cursed. Such a pattern aligns almost perfectly with the biblical account. Genesis speaks of a fertile land, so lush it's compared to Eden, suddenly transformed into a wasteland. The valley of Sodom, once well-watered, becomes a place of desolation. Later biblical texts refer to Sodom as a warning, a site of uninhabitable ruin. Isaiah, Jeremiah, and even Jesus invoke it as a symbol of complete and utter devastation. But these weren't just religious metaphors. They were descriptions of a real place, burned and salted, abandoned and feared. The city of Zoar presents an interesting case. According to Genesis, Lot begged to flee there when escaping Sodom. It was spared, apparently due to its smaller size or perhaps its lesser guilt. Archaeologists believe they may have identified Zoar near the southern end of the Dead Sea, possibly at a site called Safi. Unlike the other cities, Safi was not entirely destroyed. It shows signs of continued occupation after the catastrophe, albeit diminished. If Zoar was spared from the airburst, or struck only by its periphery, this could explain both its survival and the biblical account of Lot's refuge. Admah and Zeboim are harder to place definitively. Some scholars suggest Tal Nimrin and Tal Kafrain as candidates based on proximity, size, and destruction patterns, but the identifications remain tentative. Still, the correlation between the number of destroyed cities, their geographic clustering, and the timing of their abandonment is too precise to dismiss as coincidence. Whether or not we can attach names to ruins, the reality remains. 5 major settlements in the Jordan Valley were wiped out together, their memory preserved in religious text and their ashes buried beneath centuries of silence. The cultural impact of this regional collapse is difficult to overstate. The Jordan Valley had been a thriving center of trade and agriculture. The cities controlled access to the King's Highway, an ancient trade route connecting Egypt, the Levant, and Mesopotamia. Their destruction would have severed economic links, isolated communities, and triggered refugee migrations. The hill country to the west shows a sudden uptick in small or dispersed settlements during this time, suggesting that survivors from the plain may have resettled there. The trauma of the disaster, the sudden loss of homes, families, and farmland would have reshaped the entire region's demographics and belief systems. It's not hard to imagine how such an event, passed down through generations, might evolve into the theological narrative of divine punishment. In a world where gods controlled the weather, the harvest, and the fate of cities, the destruction of an entire valley would be seen not as random chance, but as judgment. Over time, the moral layer was added: wickedness, sin, rebellion. But at its heart, the story was about loss. The names of the cities became lessons. Sodom stood for pride, Gomorrah for cruelty. Admah and Zeboim faded into whispers. Zoar survived as a place of refuge, and behind them all loomed the memory of the fire. Some modern scholars resist these identifications, citing gaps in the archaeological record or the difficulty of matching biblical names to ancient sites. But the overall pattern is hard to ignore: a cluster of cities, simultaneous destruction, a poisoned landscape, an enduring cultural memory. Even if we strip away the theology, what remains is a remarkably accurate oral account of a Bronze Age catastrophe. That's the power of collective memory. When trauma is deep enough, it lingers. It becomes myth, story, scripture. It finds its way into prayers and proverbs, into the bones of cultures and the architecture of belief. The cities of the plain may have vanished from the earth, but they did not vanish from history. Their ruins are still there, beneath the dust, waiting for their names to be spoken again, far to the east of the Jordan Valley. In the once glorious land of Sumer, scribes were pressing cuneiform characters into wet clay with urgent purpose. Their words did not celebrate conquest or list tribute payments. They mourned. They wept for cities consumed by fire and silence. They documented destruction so absolute that even the gods, in their telling, seemed stunned by what had unfolded. These were the city laments, a genre of literature unique to ancient Mesopotamia, and they form one of the most haunting echoes in the ancient world, because in them, we find more than grief. We find fragments of memory that mirror the devastation unearthed at Tal el-Hammam and the destruction described in Genesis. The lament for Ur, perhaps the most famous of these texts, begins not with metaphor, but with geography. It names the cities that fell: Nippur, Eridu, Lagash. It describes temples abandoned, sacred fires extinguished, priests gone silent. It speaks of storms sent by the gods, winds that brought flame and death, and again, it insists that what occurred was not natural. It was decreed. The gods held counsel. They chose. They released destruction upon the cities with surgical precision, one after another. They were erased. The language is not of military defeat. It is of annihilation. In one striking passage, the lament describes fire striking rooftops first, setting structures ablaze from above before descending to street level. The image is eerily specific. Ancient fires typically began at ground level: cooking accidents, siege fires, torches flung over walls. But what happens when fire falls from the sky? Buildings burn in reverse. And that's exactly what the archaeologists at Tal el-Hammam found: burned thatch roofs and collapsed upper structures with melted clay that dripped downward. The correspondence is uncanny. The Sumerians used the word ugnim, translated alternately as storm or army, to describe the force that destroyed their cities. But it was no army of men. It brought no siege towers or battering rams. It came swiftly, with fire, with wind, with fury. Another lament describes an evil wind rising on the horizon, darkening the land. It speaks of people dropping dead where they stood, of animals collapsing mid-stride, of fields scorched so deeply that they could not grow crops for generations. In yet another stanza, it speaks of the earth itself trembling, cities being uprooted and flung aside. The imagery is not poetic flourish. It's shock. It's the attempt of survivors to describe something they had no words for. What these laments reveal is a pattern: multiple cities destroyed in rapid succession, seemingly without human agency, followed by long periods of environmental devastation and depopulation. Sound familiar? The Jordan Valley, too, saw the simultaneous ruin of at least 5 cities. The soil was salted, the land abandoned for centuries, and in both cases, the destruction was framed as divine. The Sumerians attributed it to the judgment of the Anunnaki, the assembly of gods who governed fate. The Hebrews credited Yahweh, whose angels warned Lot before the skies opened. The names differ, the tone shifts, but the skeleton of the story remains. These laments were written between 2100 and 1900 BCE, roughly 3 to 5 centuries before the destruction of Tal el-Hammam. That time gap raises questions. Are the similarities coincidental, or do they point to a recurring event, a pattern of catastrophic airbursts that scarred multiple regions and left similar trauma in their wake? Some researchers believe so. They propose that the Sumerian laments may preserve memories of a separate cosmic event, one that struck Mesopotamia and left behind the same clues: melt glass, scorched earth, trauma-laced text. The very act of writing these laments suggests urgency. Sumerian scribes documented these events not just as history, but as warning. One inscription, found on a tablet in Nippur, ends with a plea: may this not happen again. Let it be remembered. That phrase, so simple, echoes through millennia. It mirrors the message of the biblical story. It mirrors the shock of modern scientists trying to understand the destruction at Tal el-Hammam. In all 3 cases, Sumerian, Hebrew, archaeological, the core message is the same: something terrible happened. Remember it. And memory, it turns out, may be the most durable artifact of all. Clay can shatter, bones decay, structures collapse, but stories endure. They cross generations. Languages, religions, they get reshaped, certainly. But their essence survives. When a catastrophe is large enough, it does not vanish. It becomes culture. It becomes religion. It becomes identity. The Sumerian laments, read alongside Genesis and the ruins in the Jordan Valley, tell a story that refuses to die, a story of divine fire, of judgment, of grief. Some scholars caution against connecting too many dots. Correlation, they argue, is not causation. Ancient texts are full of metaphor. Different regions experience their own disasters, But even the cautious admit that the thematic overlaps are striking, too precise, too vivid, too consistent across time and geography. If these were purely invented, it would be a miracle of parallel imagination. More likely, they represent a shared inheritance, a memory passed down from those who saw cities burn and skies break open. And there's another clue. The Sumerian laments often mention 7 weapons unleashed by the gods. The texts don't describe them in modern terms, of course. They speak of brightness, of heat, of wind. But the number 7 recurs across ancient disaster narratives, from Mesopotamia to the Hebrew Bible to the later apocalyptic traditions. Perhaps it's symbolic, or perhaps it reflects attempts to categorize different effects: blast, fire, poison, darkness, tremor, salt, silence, different faces of the same horror. In this light, the laments are more than literature. They are survival mechanisms, attempts to impose meaning on chaos. They describe cities where the gods once walked, now left empty, temples stripped of their sacred power, people scattered like leaves. And in the silence that followed, scribes wrote, not to explain, but to remember. Because if someone, someday, could understand what had happened, maybe it wouldn't happen again. What's most haunting is how familiar their words feel. Written in an alien script by people who believed the world was governed by gods we no longer worship, they still speak with the voice of trauma. They still ache, they still cry out, and they remind us that we are not the first to watch fire fall from the sky. We are not the first to stand amid ruins and ask why. The laments of Sumer whisper across 4,000 years. This happened. Remember us. Learn. And the clay tablets, silent though they seem, still hold the answer. In the ancient pantheon of Mesopotamia, one figure stands apart for his terrifying associations, not merely with war, but with cosmic-scale destruction. His name was Era. To the Babylonians, he was a god of plague, fire, and death, a divine force called upon in times of upheaval. Yet, Era's most chilling role is preserved in a literary work known as the Era Epic, a composition that blurs the boundary between theology and what some believe may be catastrophic memory. In this epic, Era unleashes 7 weapons upon a rebellious world, tools of such immense power that they level cities, scorch landscapes, and silence the gods themselves. For centuries, these weapons were seen as myth, but in the aftermath of discoveries at Tal el-Hammam and the reevaluation of Sumerian lament texts, scholars and independent researchers alike have begun asking a radical question. Could these weapons have been something real? The Era Epic, written in Akkadian and preserved on clay tablets dating from the 1st millennium BCE, draws upon much older Sumerian traditions. It describes a moment of divine frustration. Humanity has grown insolent. The gods have become restless. Era, roused from his slumber, demands to act. The other deities hesitate, fearing the consequences. But Era is resolute. He arms himself with 7 terrible weapons, each with its own devastating capability, and sets forth to restore divine order by force. What follows is not a battle, but a massacre. Cities fall, temples crumble, forests burn, and through it all, Era moves like a storm, a being beyond comprehension. Descriptions of the 7 weapons are particularly striking. One is said to unleash a brightness brighter than the sun at midnight. Another emits a wind so powerful that it rips trees from the roots and flattens the mountains. A third spreads sickness among survivors, causing hair and nails to fall out, flesh to blister, and waters to turn bitter. The imagery resonates with anyone familiar with the effects of extreme heat, radiation, and explosive shock waves. Some researchers have drawn uncomfortable parallels between these descriptions and what was witnessed at nuclear test sites in the 20th century. The brightness, the shock waves, the after effects of illness, they all align disturbingly well with the known symptoms of radiation exposure and high-energy explosions. But it is not only modern parallels that compel attention. The geographical hints in the Era Epic are as provocative as the weaponry. One passage places the destruction in a land rich with bitumen, east of a great body of salt water. This aligns with the Dead Sea region, known in antiquity for its natural asphalt deposits. The Valley of Siddim, where Sodom and Gomorrah are said to have stood, was described in Genesis as full of tar pits. The combination of natural flammables and dense population would have made the area catastrophically vulnerable to fire from above, whether divine or celestial. Some versions of the era epic even mention 5 cities falling. The number is notable. It matches the biblical account of the 5 cities of the plain: Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Zoar. However, scholars caution that the text does not name these cities directly. The connection is interpretive, not definitive. Still, when ancient Mesopotamian literature speaks of 5 cities destroyed by a god using 7 unnatural weapons in a region geographically similar to the Jordan Valley, it's difficult not to consider the implications. The nature of the weapons themselves raises deeper questions. In Sumerian and Akkadian, the term tukul is often used, translated as weapon or tool, but in many contexts, it implies a constructed device, a made thing, not a force of nature. The weapons of Era are not storms or floods. They are released with intention, targeted, activated. Their descriptions suggest mechanisms, not metaphors. They produce light, sound, wind, poison. They operate in sequence, and they are remembered not as symbols of chaos, but as deliberate instruments of devastation. This precision is part of what fuels modern speculation. Authors like Zecharia Sitchin, controversial but influential, have suggested that these weapons were not mythical at all, but technological. That the gods of Mesopotamia were not divine in the spiritual sense, but beings with advanced capabilities, whose actions were later interpreted as the acts of deities. While mainstream academia rejects Sitchin's conclusions, it cannot ignore the consistency of the ancient descriptions. Whether interpreted theologically or metaphorically, the texts speak of directed destruction, light that blinds, winds that pulverize, aftermaths that poison. Some scholars propose that the era epic encodes a memory of real catastrophe, one transmitted across centuries in mythic form. Others believe it reflects the trauma of urban collapse during periods of war or natural disaster. Yet the language is not of ordinary warfare. The epic doesn't describe enemies storming gates or burning granaries. It speaks of annihilation from above. And, in a literary tradition known for detail and specificity, that choice of imagery feels intentional. The overlap with the Sumerian laments deepens the intrigue. Both genres, epic and lament, describe divine assemblies, debates among gods, and the release of unnatural forces upon cities that were once protected. In both, destruction is justified as punishment, but seems to exceed the intended scope. The texts speak of regret, of gods mourning the very cities they ordered destroyed. In one lament, a goddess weeps that her temple was reduced to rubble and cries out that the evil wind took more than it should have. These are not triumphant records. They are confessions. Something was unleashed that could not be contained. The theological framing in these texts served a cultural function. Ancient societies needed a way to explain catastrophe. They didn't have access to the language of physics or geology. So they explained through the divine, but that doesn't mean the underlying events weren't real. It only means they were recorded in the vocabulary available at the time. Fire from the sky became wrath. Blinding light became judgment. Poisoned water became curse. Yet under those layers of metaphor may lie a preserved description of real events, encoded, mythologized, but factual. The era epic stands at the crossroads of myth and memory. It may be fiction, it may be scripture, or it may be something in between, a literary fossil of an actual event, now buried under the weight of centuries. Its 7 weapons remain unnamed, their nature elusive, but their effects, as described, are chillingly familiar. And when read beside the laments of Sumer, the ruins of Tal el-Hammam, and the pages of Genesis, they form a tapestry of testimony, a chorus of ancient voices saying, in their own way, the same thing. Fire came from the sky, and cities died. Whether from gods, stars, or something else entirely, the result was always the same: ash, silence, and stories that would refuse to fade. To grasp the full weight of the Sumerian laments and their chilling detail, we must first reckon with who the Sumerians actually were. Too often, ancient civilizations are flattened into stereotypes: primitive, superstitious, technologically backward, but the Sumerians, who flourished in southern Mesopotamia over 4,000 years ago, were anything but. They were the world's first literate culture, the pioneers of writing, law, mathematics, and urban planning. By the 3rd millennium BCE, they had built cities that rivaled later Roman metropolises in scale and complexity. They developed irrigation systems, codified commercial law, and mapped the stars with astonishing precision. And perhaps most importantly, they wrote everything down. Cuneiform, the script they invented by pressing styluses into wet clay, was more than a writing system. It was a method of memory preservation. Sumerian scribes recorded trade transactions, agricultural data, medical treatments, astronomical observations, religious hymns, and, most pertinent to our story, accounts of destruction. Tens of thousands of clay tablets have survived, most untranslated, still gathering dust in museums. But those that have been studied paint a portrait of a civilization obsessed with documentation. This is crucial, because it means the laments that survive are not literary outliers. They are part of a broader system of historical record-keeping. Sober, systematic, and deeply invested in accuracy. Sumerians were also intimately familiar with warfare. By 2500 BCE, they had professional armies, organized into disciplined units. Their kings, like Aeneadem of Lagash, led sieges and territorial campaigns. The famous stele of the vultures, carved around 2450 BCE, shows phalanx formations, chariots, and grotesque scenes of post-battle mutilation. They knew what war looked like, what burning cities smelled like, how sieges played out, how bodies piled up. Their scribes had vocabulary for it, imagery for it, theology for it. And yet, the destruction described in their laments is different. It lacks the language of war. There are no enemies at the gates, no triumphs, no spoils, only silence, ash, and a wind that came from nowhere. In one of the laments, the scribes specify that the typical instruments of battle, spears, arrows, sling stones, were not used. They go out of their way to say that no human hand caused the devastation. The enemy did not wield pickaxes, one text reads, yet the buildings fell. Another says, no army advanced, but the people perished in their homes. These lines are not metaphorical. They are meant to rule out familiar causes. They are saying, we've seen wars. This was something else. This leads to another fascinating detail, the mention of strange effects that go beyond normal physical destruction. One text refers to an evil wind that caused people and animals to drop dead without visible wounds. Another speaks of a poisonous cloud that lingered in the air, rendering land uninhabitable. Still another mentions that fields became barren and that even the water tasted of death. For modern readers, these effects, sudden death, environmental contamination, long-term sterility of the land, bring to mind radiation exposure. While we cannot impose 21st century science on a Bronze Age worldview, we also cannot ignore the precision of the observations. This raises a possibility often overlooked, that the Sumerians, without modern terminology, were recording empirical observations of environmental trauma. They didn't know about cosmic impacts or nuclear radiation, but they had eyes, noses, and memories. They described what they saw and felt in the terms they had, and those descriptions, once dismissed as poetic exaggeration, now seem disturbingly literal when placed beside sites like Tal el-Hammam. The temperature evidence, the salt deposits, the burn patterns, it's all there, written not in English or Latin, but in the oldest written language on Earth. Their understanding of the cosmos also deserves attention. The Sumerians tracked celestial bodies meticulously. They divided the sky into constellations, followed planetary movements, and even predicted eclipses. Their base 60 system is still embedded in our measurement of time: 60 seconds, 60 minutes, 360 degrees. They weren't astronomers in the modern sense, but they observed the heavens with disciplined curiosity. If a bright light had appeared in the sky before a catastrophic explosion, they would have noticed. And while their cosmology spoke of gods and divine realms, it also embedded practical knowledge. When they said the destruction came from above, they may have been stating a fact as much as invoking a deity. Some of their vocabulary is particularly haunting. The word immu appears frequently in destruction texts. While it means wind or storm, it also connotes heat and brightness. Another term, imhul, translates as evil wind, and is described as carrying death, stinging skin, blinding eyes. One lament says, "The evil wind came, and the corpses melted into the earth." That is not how conventional warfare works. That's how radiation, heat blasts, or chemical exposure behaves. Even the phrase "dust of death" appears in some interpretations, though it's debated whether this is a literal translation or an interpretive gloss. Still, the pattern is consistent: rapid death, environmental ruin, divine origin. Of course, the theological overlay cannot be ignored. The Sumerians believed the gods governed all aspects of life. Catastrophe required divine explanation. When cities fell, it was because Enlil or Enki or Ninhursag had withdrawn their protection or issued judgment. This theological necessity, however, does not negate the empirical data embedded in the texts. It merely filters it through the worldview of the time. And here lies a crucial point. If modern readers are willing to peel back the theological lens, not discard it, but see through it, what remains may be a shockingly detailed account of real, physical events. Even more provocative is the fact that the destruction in these texts often exceeds the intentions of the gods. In one lament, Enki pleads to spare the city. In another, a goddess weeps and asks, "Why did you let this happen?" These are not triumphant records of divine justice. They are documents of regret. The gods mourn, they act surprised, they speak of restraint that was intended but not achieved. It suggests that the storytellers themselves were struggling to understand what had happened. Not just why, but how. And perhaps that is the most human element of all. In the wake of inexplicable destruction, the scribes of ancient Sumer did what all people do when faced with trauma. They recorded, they searched for meaning. They tried to ensure that what had happened would not be lost. Their tablets are not sermons. They are testimonies. They are voices saying, "We saw this. We survived this. We don't understand it, but we remember." Modern science continues to test the boundaries of what ancient people knew. Some want to believe the Sumerians had access to advanced technologies, that they inherited lost knowledge from forgotten civilizations. Others argue for a more grounded view, that they were simply brilliant observers with deep cultural memory and a passion for record-keeping. Either way, what they left behind demands to be taken seriously, not because it confirms modern theories, but because it challenges us to reconsider the line between myth and memory. What did the Sumerians really know? Maybe more than we're comfortable admitting. Maybe enough to warn us. Maybe enough to show us that history is not just a series of wars and kings, but a fragile thread of memory stretching back through catastrophe, through ash and fire, through lamentation etched into clay. And if we listen, really listen, we may still hear their voices, whispering across time, "Remember, watch the sky, it happened once, it could happen again." The moment we begin to ask whether ancient texts like the Sumerian laments and the era epic might contain more than metaphor, we step into a space that is as fascinating as it is controversial. That space is occupied by thinkers who defy academic consensus, people who ask, what if the ancient gods were not divine beings in the spiritual sense, but literal ones? What if they had knowledge, technology, or origins far beyond what we currently allow ourselves to consider? And perhaps no single figure embodies this boundary-pushing mindset more than Zecharia Sitchin. Sitchin, a Russian-born author with a background in economics, spent decades studying Mesopotamian texts and developing his now famous theory that the Anunnaki, the gods of Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon, were not mythological figures at all, but extraterrestrials. According to him, these beings came from a distant planet called Nibiru and interacted directly with early humans, sharing knowledge, manipulating genetics, and even engaging in warfare. The boldest of Sitchin's claims suggests that the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was not merely an act of divine judgment, but the result of a targeted strike, what he interpreted as the use of nuclear weapons by the Anunnaki. Mainstream scholars have largely dismissed Sitchin's interpretations. His translations are criticized as inaccurate, his etymology as flawed, and his conclusions as speculative in the extreme. The word Anunnaki, they argue, simply refers to the princely offspring or divine descendants in Sumerian cosmology. gods who ruled over the heavens and the underworld, not alien engineers. Terms like too cool, which Sitchin reads as high-tech weapons, are more commonly understood to mean implements or tools in the standard military or ritual sense. Yet, despite academic rejection, his work has remained immensely popular, precisely because it touches on something deeper than scholarship, an instinctive curiosity about the unexplained. One reason Sitchin's ideas continue to thrive is that they attempt to reconcile ancient texts with anomalous archaeological findings. Take, for example, the descriptions of fire that melts stone, winds that kill without touch, or land so poisoned that nothing grows. Sitchin read these passages not as myth, but as observation. He pointed to the destruction at Tal el-Hammam as evidence: melted pottery, charred bones, and high salt concentrations as the aftermath of an ancient nuclear event. He suggested that the Anunnaki used advanced weapons to settle internal disputes, citing accounts from the Era epic and other laments that describe overwhelming devastation delivered from the sky. Perhaps the most famous connection he made was with the biblical story of Lot's wife. In Genesis, she turns into a pillar of salt after looking back at the destruction. Sitchin interpreted this not as metaphor or punishment, but as a literal description of what modern science calls flash calcination, the instantaneous burning and mineralization of organic tissue under intense heat, as seen in nuclear detonations. It's a dramatic theory, but it hinges on one undeniable fact. Something at Tal el-Hammam caused temperatures so high that clay melted and bones disintegrated. That kind of heat, sustained across a wide area, still defies easy explanation. And yet, Sitchin's conclusions face a fundamental challenge. There is no clear evidence of radioactivity at ancient sites like Tal el-Hammam, no residual isotopes, no plutonium traces, no artificial materials conclusively pointing to advanced technology. While the melt glass found at the site resembles trinitite, the fused sand formed during the Trinity nuclear test in New Mexico, chemically, it does not match the same radioactive profile. This, critics argue, undermines any serious claim that nuclear weapons were involved. If something exploded over Tal el-Hammam, it was natural, not artificial. But that brings us to a deeper philosophical question. If the destruction wasn't man-made, and if Bronze Age societies lacked the technology to cause such damage, then what remains? A cosmic airburst? Perhaps. But airbursts are rare and typically random. The Tal el-Hammam event appears precise, localized, and targeted. Over 20 cities were affected, all within a narrow geographic band. Could it be that ancient people witnessed something so overwhelming that they could only interpret it as divine, or worse, intentional? This is the space where Sitchin's theories linger, not necessarily as science, but as provocations. He forces us to ask what our ancestors saw, whether the Anunnaki were aliens or not. Ancient texts consistently describe them as physical beings who walked among humans, ate and drank, debated policy, and wielded terrifying power. Unlike the abstract gods of later monotheism, the Sumerian deities were tangible. They arrived in flying vessels, left scorch marks on the ground, and delivered destruction from above. That is not metaphorical language. It's observational. And while mainstream scholars attribute these stories to literary convention or symbolic theology, some researchers believe they deserve a second look. Because, regardless of whether the Anunnaki were real in the literal sense, their presence in the historical imagination suggests something profound. These gods didn't just represent natural forces, they were characters in a story of power, morality, and technology, perhaps echoing real events so traumatic that they shaped religion itself. The Sumerians didn't invent destruction, they recorded it. And if some of their records sound like descriptions of airbursts, radiation, or weapons beyond their means, we must ask, were they witnessing something real and explaining it the only way they could? Sitchin's legacy is a complicated one. He brought attention to texts most people had never heard of. He made connections, however speculative, that inspired thousands to study ancient history. And while his conclusions may stretch credibility, his instincts were rooted in a very old human impulse, the desire to make sense of the inexplicable. In a world where cities can vanish overnight, where fire can fall from heaven and leave no crater, sometimes myth becomes the only language we have. So, do we dismiss the Anunnaki as ancient science fiction? Or do we consider that the stories we inherited, of gods and chariots of fire, of weapons that turned men to ash, of divine councils that decided the fate of nations, might be cultural echoes of something forgotten? Not proof of aliens, perhaps, but proof that ancient people saw and survived events that defy our modern understanding, and they left us clues, not in binary code or satellite transmissions, but in clay and ink, in hymns and laments. They wrote, "This happened. We don't know how, but we remember." When ancient texts and modern ruins begin to tell the same story, the line between theology and history begins to blur. Nowhere is this convergence more powerful than in the biblical account of Sodom and Gomorrah. Genesis chapter 19 presents a narrative not only of divine judgment, but of human pleading, of survival, of directional escape, and of utter annihilation. At first glance, it seems mythic, fire from heaven. A woman turned to salt, angels warning a family to flee. But as more physical evidence is uncovered at Tal el-Hammam and surrounding sites, what once seemed purely symbolic now bears uncanny similarities to a real event, observed, recorded, and passed down through generations. In the Genesis narrative, Abraham pleads with God not to destroy the cities if even 10 righteous people can be found. This scene humanizes the destruction. It isn't random, it isn't nature, it is presented as deliberate, conditional, even negotiable. Ultimately, the plea fails, but the framing of the event as a targeted action, rather than an indiscriminate disaster, mirrors what the archaeological evidence suggests, a tightly localized catastrophe. At Tal el-Hammam, destruction struck a clearly defined area, around 25 kilometers across, devastating cities within that zone while leaving others relatively untouched. This is not the pattern of a region-wide famine, war, or earthquake. It is precise, focused, and sudden. Lot and his family are warned in advance and told to flee without looking back. They escape to a small town called Zoar, which is spared. Lot's wife disobeys and turns back, only to become a pillar of salt for centuries. This detail puzzled scholars. Salt is not typically associated with transformation in biblical metaphors. Why salt, and why that specific description? The destruction layer at Tal el-Hammam contains extraordinarily high salt concentrations, some samples as high as 25%. The source? Likely vaporized Dead Sea brine. The hypothesis that an airburst over or near the Dead Sea flung salt-rich water into the sky and distributed it across the valley fits both the archaeological findings and the literary image. If Lot's wife hesitated, even momentarily, she may have been caught in the blast or wave of salt-laden superheated air. The transformation into a pillar of salt might not be metaphorical at all. It may be cultural memory preserving an actual thermal event. The directionality of the destruction provides more support. Archaeological analysis of debris fields at Tal el-Hammam shows that materials, pottery shards, mud brick fragments, even human remains, were scattered from southwest to northeast, suggesting the force came from that direction. Genesis places Abraham west of the destruction site, near Bethel, watching smoke rise like the smoke of a furnace. He would have been upwind, distant but still within view. Lot fled eastward, away from the epicenter. The directional details in the biblical text match the blast vectors reconstructed by modern researchers. This alignment is not a result of interpretive contortions. It's a match across multiple data points: textual, geological, and forensic. What the Bible calls divine wrath may, in this reading, have been the Bronze Age human attempt to describe an airburst, an atmospheric explosion so intense that it resembled the hand of a god. The fire from heaven, the smoke, the destruction of only certain cities, the salt, the instant death, it all fits. And yet, the theological framing matters. To the ancient Hebrews, the destruction wasn't random, it was punishment. The cities of Sodom and Gomorrah are described not just as wicked, but as violently unjust, inhospitable, and abusive. Their fall becomes a moral lesson. Remember Sodom, prophets would later say, warning of judgment for arrogance and cruelty. But when we compare this theological interpretation to the Sumerian perspective, the contrast is stark. The Sumerian laments do not moralize the destruction. They grieve it. Their gods do not rejoice in punishment. They express regret. Enlil has abandoned Nippur, the text says. Enki has departed Eridu. The tone is not of righteous cleansing, but of unintended catastrophe. Even the divine assembly, according to the texts, did not anticipate the totality of what would occur. One goddess weeps that the winds destroyed more than she thought they would. The implication is of a disaster unleashed by design, but spiraling beyond control. Could these two traditions, Hebrew and Sumerian, be describing the same event through different lenses? One sees judgment, the other sees tragedy. One blames sin, the other mourns loss. But both describe the same core experience: cities falling in fire from the sky, land made uninhabitable, survivors scattered, memory preserved. Even the list of cities lines up, with 5 urban centers destroyed in both accounts. Even the outcome is the same: centuries of desolation, abandonment, and eventual reinterpretation of the event through theology. What makes this convergence so compelling is that it was never supposed to happen. The biblical authors and the Sumerian scribes were separated by geography, language, and culture. Yet their stories overlap in ways that seem less like coincidence and more like shared memory. Oral tradition, after all, is durable, especially when tied to trauma. Events that shake the foundations of a civilization are not easily forgotten. They are encoded into the cultural psyche, passed down through liturgy, legend, and lamentation. Dr. Stephen Collins, the lead archaeologist at Tal el-Hammam, has argued that the site matches every geographical and cultural detail described in Genesis. He points to its elevation on the edge of the Jordan Valley, its size, its role as a regional power, and its catastrophic destruction. Critics counter that dating is imprecise, that Genesis was written centuries later, that identifications based on text are inherently speculative. But Collins and his team point to the material evidence: the burn layers, the melted surfaces, the absence of a military cause, the sudden depopulation, as facts that speak louder than theory. Perhaps the most chilling element of the biblical account is its emphasis on targeting. God does not destroy the entire region. He spares Zoar. He warns Lot. He listens to Abraham. The destruction is directed. The Sumerian texts, too, describe divine deliberation. Cities are chosen, orders are given, forces are released. The idea that a cosmic or artificial force could target specific urban areas, leaving other regions untouched, aligns uncomfortably well with the concentrated damage observed in the archaeological record. Theologically, this raises profound questions. If the event was natural, a meteor exploding over the Jordan Valley, then the ancient writer's conclusion that it was divine judgment may have been a theological overlay placed on an incomprehensible tragedy. But what if the narrative reflects something more layered, a real event, remembered by those who survived, interpreted through the moral frameworks of their cultures, and passed down as both warning and witness? The fire that fell from heaven might not have been sent by God, but it was no less destructive. And perhaps, to those who saw it, the distinction didn't matter. In a world where the sky suddenly erupts in flame, where entire cities vanish in an instant, and where memory is the only thing left behind, what better language could they have used than the language of divinity? So, the question remains, were Sodom and Gomorrah destroyed by moral reckoning or cosmic accident? Or could the answer be both, a real event filtered through spiritual understanding? If the Bible preserved accurate details of geography, timing, and destruction, it would mean that ancient texts contain more historical data than modern readers often assume. It would suggest that theology and archaeology are not enemies, but companions, two lenses viewing the same past from different angles. And if so, then the warnings of Genesis are not just moral allegories, they are echoes, not just of wrath, but of a fire that really fell, of a land that really burned, of a people who really died, and of a story that refused to be forgotten. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah may be the most famous, but it is far from the only tale of cities consumed by fire from the sky. Across the ancient world, from the Mediterranean to South Asia, from the Americas to East Asia, There exist strikingly similar myths and legends. These stories often describe celestial destruction, sudden flashes of light, great heat, walls of fire, land rendered barren, and survivors who flee in terror. For centuries, such stories were dismissed as metaphor, religious allegory, or coincidence. But in light of new archaeological discoveries and modern geological models, some researchers have begun to wonder, do these ancient narratives preserve real memories of global cataclysms? Consider the Greeks. In their myth of Phaethon, the son of the sun god Helios steals his father's chariot and loses control of it. The fiery horses veer off course, scorching the earth and turning lush fields to desert before Zeus strikes Phaethon down with a thunderbolt to end the chaos. The story has long been interpreted as a moral warning against hubris, but the imagery is unmistakable. A fiery object moving across the sky, widespread burning, sudden death, and divine intervention. Some scholars have noted that this description closely matches that of a meteor airburst, a blazing object overhead, intense heat radiating downward, devastation concentrated over a specific region. In ancient India, the Mahabharata tells of a divine weapon called the Brahmastra, an object of terrifying power. When unleashed, it produces a column of flame brighter than 1,000 suns. It levels entire cities, causes hair and nails to fall from the bodies of survivors, and renders the land infertile. One passage even notes that pottery shattered and animals perished instantly. While traditionally interpreted through the lens of Hindu cosmology, these vivid effects bear a curious resemblance to the thermal and radiological consequences of a high-energy explosion. Could it be that the Mahabharata preserves echoes of an event observed in deep antiquity and later cast into epic form? Mesoamerican traditions. 2. Speak of celestial destruction. The Aztecs and the Maya told of previous worlds that ended in fire or flood, often caused by cosmic conflict. In one version of the Maya Popol Vuh, gods punished the first, failed humans by destroying them in a fiery cataclysm. Egyptian records include stories of divine retribution involving flame and smoke, while early Chinese myths recount the fire god Zhurong battling rebel forces and accidentally scorching vast tracts of land in the process. In every region, the pattern is similar: sudden and total destruction, fire descending from the heavens, land transformed into wasteland, and a divine or supernatural agent responsible. The frequency of these motifs has led some researchers to explore the idea of a shared human memory, a global mythological echo of cosmic catastrophe. Graham Hancock and other proponents of alternative history have taken this idea further, proposing that Earth's distant past was punctuated by periodic cosmic impacts, events large enough to destroy civilizations and reset history. Hancock points to the end of the last ice age, around 12,800 years ago, when dramatic climate shifts and megafaunal extinctions occurred across the planet. Some geologists now believe this period, known as the Younger Dryas, may have been triggered by a series of comet fragments striking Earth. If true, it would explain the emergence of global flood myths and perhaps other disaster narratives handed down through millennia. This leads us to the Taurid meteor stream, a debris field believed to be the remnant of a giant comet that broke apart around 20,000 years ago. Earth passes through the Taurid stream twice each year, in late June and early November. While most of the fragments are tiny, the stream includes larger bodies, some as wide as several hundred meters. These are not theoretical. Astronomers have tracked dozens of near-Earth objects whose orbits align with the Taurids. Statistically, a major impact or airburst from this stream could occur every few centuries. The Tunguska event in 1908 may have been one such occurrence. Could another have struck the Jordan Valley in 1650 BCE? The airburst hypothesis, when viewed through this lens, is not just plausible, it becomes part of a larger, repeating pattern. If ancient civilizations periodically experienced these skyborne disasters, it would explain the recurring themes in their mythologies. The fire from heaven would not be metaphor. It would be memory, encoded in the only language available at the time: divine punishment, celestial war, godly wrath, and memory, especially collective memory, is astonishingly resilient. Indigenous Australian communities, for instance, have passed down oral traditions of sea level rise that correspond to coastal flooding events over 10,000 years ago. Native American legends of fiery serpents falling from the sky may preserve recollections of meteor showers or comet fragments. In Finland and Siberia, myths describe the sky opening and flames consuming the land, narratives uncannily similar to the Tunguska explosion. Skeptics argue that humans are wired to fear the sky, that fire and storms are universal experiences, and that similar myths arise naturally across disconnected cultures. It's a valid point, but the level of specificity in many of these accounts challenges the idea of coincidence. When distant societies all describe blinding light, shock waves, poisoned air, and barren land, and when archaeological evidence increasingly supports the occurrence of ancient high-temperature events, it becomes harder to dismiss the stories as mere metaphor. The archaeological record shows multiple abrupt collapses in the Bronze Age. Around 2200 BCE, the Akkadian Empire fell, coinciding with severe drought and possible atmospheric disturbances. Around 1200 BCE, the Late Bronze Age collapse saw the sudden fall of major civilizations in the eastern Mediterranean. Cities burned, trade networks disintegrated, and writing systems disappeared. While warfare and economic instability played roles, some researchers suggest that natural disasters, possibly airbursts, could have accelerated or even initiated these collapses. This brings us back to Tal el-Hammam. If the destruction there was caused by a cosmic airburst, it may have been one of many, perhaps not global, but regional, a localized disaster remembered so vividly that it became sacred. Perhaps the people who survived Sodom's fall were no different than the survivors of Tunguska or the Younger Dryas. They watched the sky ignite, they heard buildings shatter, they buried their dead, and they told the story. And the story traveled, it evolved, it merged with theology, morality, cosmology, over generations. It became scripture, it became lament, it became myth, but the bones of the memory remained, the fire, the judgment, the silence. As we read these ancient texts, Genesis, the era epic, the Mahabharata, the Popol Vuh, we are not merely reading poetry, we are standing at the edge of memory, at the place where story meets event, where ancient humans, overwhelmed by a sky gone mad, struggled to understand, to preserve, to warn. If these stories all stem from real cataclysms, then the myths of global fire are not fantasy. They are warnings, not just about the wrath of gods, but about the fragility of civilization, about how, in a single moment, everything can vanish, and about how only memory remains, memory carried in stone, in clay, in song, waiting for someone, somewhere, to listen. Ancient civilizations rarely fell quietly. Their ends were often swift, brutal, and bewildering. In archaeology, we frequently encounter debris layers thick with ash, cities buried in silence, and trade networks that once spanned continents suddenly vanish. These collapses leave behind more than ruins. They leave questions. And when examined carefully, patterns begin to emerge. Periods where multiple civilizations across vast regions suffer simultaneous disaster. Historians call them collapses. But what if some were not gradual declines, not merely economic or political failures, but the aftermaths of catastrophes so severe that they erased centuries of progress in mere days? The destruction of Tal el-Hammam around 1650 BCE fits neatly into this global puzzle. It wasn't just one city. Within a radius of 25 kilometers, at least 20 other settlements were abandoned during the same narrow time window. These were not minor outposts. They were complex urban centers, agriculturally prosperous, militarily fortified, and culturally significant. Their sudden silence echoes other known collapses in the ancient world. And some researchers are now asking, was Tal el-Hammam just one victim in a wider cascade of destruction? 2 centuries earlier, around 2200 BCE, the Akkadian Empire, then the most powerful force in Mesopotamia, collapsed. Records describe a period of chaos, famine, drought, failed harvests, and the abandonment of entire cities. The empire's fall was so severe that writing nearly disappeared in some regions. Scholars traditionally blamed climate change, particularly a severe aridification event known as the 4.2 kiloyear event. But even here, there are peculiarities, sudden shifts in population, burn layers, signs of violent ends in cities that had stood for centuries. Was it only climate? Or something else? Perhaps another cosmic encounter, like the one that might have destroyed Sodom? Then came the more famous catastrophe, the Late Bronze Age collapse, around 1200 BCE. Over a span of just a few decades, nearly every major power in the eastern Mediterranean and Near East fell. The Mycenaeans, the Hittites, the Canaanite city-states, and even Egypt staggered under the weight of destruction. Cities burned, palaces crumbled, trade stopped, literacy vanished in many areas. The reasons remain debated: earthquakes, invasion, internal rebellion, economic failure, but none of those explain why the collapse was so widespread, so synchronized. The possibility of external catastrophe, disease, volcanic eruption, or airburst has gained attention in recent years. Indeed, a cosmic pattern may be at play. The Earth is not alone in space. It shares its orbit with debris, fragments of ancient comets, broken asteroids, and ice rocks that pass close every few centuries. Among the most dangerous of these is the torrid meteor stream. This stream, composed of the remnants of a massive disintegrated comet, includes larger fragments, some perhaps hundreds of meters wide. Earth passes through the torrids twice each year. Most years, it's harmless, only a few shooting stars. But once in a while, a larger object may enter Earth's atmosphere. When that happens, destruction follows. The Tunguska event of 1908 is often cited as the best-known example. A 50-meter object exploded over Siberia, leveling 2,000 square kilometers of forest. No crater, no impact, just heat, wind, and devastation. Now imagine a similar event striking a populated urban center, like Tal el Hammam. The archaeological evidence, melted pottery, collapsed walls, vaporized roofs, and high salt levels, becomes more than strange. It becomes explanatory. And if it happened once, it could have happened before. And again, statistical modeling shows that significant airburst events, comparable to Tunguska, could occur every few hundred to 1,000 years, not globally, but locally. When they occur over oceans or uninhabited regions, they pass unnoticed. But when they intersect with civilization, they become legend, or scripture, or myth. Perhaps the destruction of the cities of the plain was one such intersection, where celestial mechanics collided with human lives, rewriting history in an instant. Some scientists believe the Younger Dryas period, around 12,800 years ago, was triggered by such an event, a comet fragment striking the ice sheets of North America. That impact, they argue, led to sudden climate change, mass extinctions, and possibly the collapse of an earlier, now lost human culture. While the evidence remains debated, discoveries of high-temperature melt glass, microspherules, and unusual platinum levels across multiple continents support the idea of a cosmic trigger. If true, it would mean our planet's history includes periodic resets, catastrophic encounters with spaceborne threats, and civilizations, no matter how advanced, are not immune. The Sumerians, with their libraries and armies, fell. The Akkadians, with their irrigation and bureaucracy, fell. The Mycenaeans, with their fortresses and fleet, fell. Collapse doesn't always come from within. Sometimes it comes from above. And the stories we inherit, of gods throwing thunderbolts, of stars falling to earth, of cities turned to ash, may be the only remaining witness to those moments. This raises a disturbing implication. If airbursts or impacts have played a greater role in human history than previously thought, then our current understanding of civilization's fragility needs revision. We plan for war, for economic downturns, even for pandemics, but we give little thought to the sky. Yet statistically, Earth is overdue for another Tunguska-scale event. And as our cities grow, as we cluster populations and infrastructure in dense urban centers, the potential consequences multiply. A single strike today over a modern metropolis could erase millions in seconds. What ancient peoples saw as divine punishment, we now understand as natural phenomena. But knowledge doesn't lessen the danger. The power of these events remains the same. What's different is our ability to prepare, or fail to. The Sumerians didn't have telescopes. The people of Sodom didn't have satellite monitoring. They couldn't see it coming. We can, and yet we barely look. But perhaps the ancients did leave us warnings, not just in their stories, but in their ruins. They told us what happens when fire falls from the sky. They showed us what remains when cities are reduced to ash, and they pressed their grief into clay, ensuring that even if their names were forgotten, their lessons would not be. Across the world, from the Nile to the Indus, from the Tigris to the Aegean, we find abrupt ends, cities buried, scripts abandoned, technologies lost. Every collapse carries its own reasons. Climate, conflict, leadership failure, but in the background of many lies, the specter of sudden, unexplainable devastation, the kind that shatters not just buildings, but memory itself. And so we must ask, how many myths are histories? How many warnings have we ignored? The tale of Sodom is one. The laments of Sumer are others. The myths of fire gods, divine weapons, and falling stars may be more than folklore. They may be archives, encrypted not in code, but in metaphor, waiting to be read, waiting to be believed. Tal el-Hammam is not just a ruin. It is a monument to a moment, a point on Earth's timeline when nature, or something beyond it, reminded humanity of its fragility. And in remembering that moment, in interpreting the ruins and the texts side by side, we do more than understand the past. We prepare for the future, because the fire that fell once may fall again, and next time, we might be the ones remembered only in fragments, in melted stone, in shattered glass, in stories whispered to a world still listening. When the fire stopped and the wind died down, when the smoke drifted away and the walls crumbled into silence, someone remained. Survivors emerged, not as triumphant heroes, but as broken witnesses. They returned to cities that were no longer cities, only scorched ruins, melted pottery, and the unrecognizable shapes of once familiar places. And then, remarkably, they did something uniquely human. They wrote, with stylus and clay. Trembling hands preserved the unspeakable. They didn't write triumph or vengeance. They wrote grief. And from that grief came one of the most extraordinary literary traditions in human history. The Sumerian laments, the lament for the lament for Eridu, and others are not just poetic compositions. They are trauma documents. The raw emotion encoded in their verses speaks of survivors trying to understand a destruction that felt both sudden and sacred. The scribes describe divine withdrawal, the gods abandoning their temples as fires consumed them. They describe families scattered, children lost, and homes reduced to silence. What makes these laments powerful is not only their content, but their tone. They do not moralize, they do not justify, they mourn. One passage reads, "The people moan, the mother looked away from her daughter, the father turned from his son." In a few short lines, it captures the disorientation of catastrophe, the moment when survival demands abandoning what matters most. These laments do not flinch from the horror, they lean into it. They speak of bones turned to dust, of livestock dying in the fields, of food stores turned to ash. And always the question behind the words, why? Scribes attributed the destruction to divine decree, but often with an undercurrent of confusion. The gods, it seemed, had gone too far. In the lament for Sumer and a goddess weeps, asking why her temple was destroyed. "Did I not serve you faithfully?" she cries. The implication is clear. Even the divine were shaken by what occurred. This is not merely theology, it is a psychological record. These lines reveal an emotional landscape that mirrors our modern responses to disaster, disbelief, sorrow, rage, and a desperate search for meaning. At Tal el-Hammam, we find the physical equivalent of these laments: burned walls, melted rooftops, bones so fragmented that they defy reconstruction. If someone at Sodom survived, someone who escaped the blast or returned later, they may have stood in the ashes, stunned. Just like the scribes of they may not have had clay tablets, but they had memories. And eventually, those memories reached the pages of Genesis, filtered through generations of oral tradition and reinterpreted through the lens of divine judgment. What unites the Sumerian and biblical traditions is not just the destruction itself, but the insistence that it be remembered. May this not happen again, one tablet concludes. It is a direct plea, not to gods, but to the future, to us. These writers knew they couldn't rebuild their cities, but they could preserve the story. They could make the memory permanent. That belief that words could outlast stone is what links ancient scribes to modern humanity. Memory was sacred to the Sumerians. Their scribal schools trained elites not just in language, but in the preservation of culture. Clay, surprisingly, became their most enduring medium. While papyrus rotted and parchment decayed, clay tablets survived. Buried in sand and silt, they resisted fire and time. When modern archaeologists uncovered them, they found not just data, but emotion. Not just lists, but laments. The details preserved in these texts are astonishingly precise. Names of cities, descriptions of weather, notes on crop failure and water contamination. One text mentions that the ground burned beneath the feet, that the wind carried a stinging breath, that shadows no longer brought relief. These are not metaphors, they are observations, encoded in poetic form because poetry was the memory tool of the time. What we are reading is eyewitness testimony, stylized, but rooted in experience. And the Sumerians were not alone in this effort. Other cultures developed their own forms of catastrophic memory. Egyptian hymns describing the days of fire, Hebrew psalms of mourning, and later, medieval chronicles of plague and war. But the Sumerians were the first to formalize lamentation as a genre, a ritualized outpouring of loss that could be taught, copied, and passed forward. It is no coincidence that many laments include instructions for public reading. They were meant to be recited aloud, in temples, during festivals of remembrance. The act of mourning was collective. This suggests a culture deeply aware of the importance of shared trauma, of preserving emotional truth alongside historical fact. In that sense, the scribes were not just historians. They were therapists of a wounded civilization. This same function may explain the origins of the biblical destruction narratives. Genesis 19 is short, but emotionally charged. Lot fleeing with his daughters, his wife's transformation, Abraham watching smoke rise from afar. There is no celebration, no victory, just awe, sorrow, and survival. This emotional framing links it to the lament tradition. Though reframed through monotheistic theology, its structure mirrors the grief of earlier civilizations. And this raises a crucial point. Memory transmission is not about exact detail. It is about emotional resonance. What matters most is not whether the fire fell from a divine realm or a disintegrating comet. What matters is that people saw it, felt it, survived it, and told others. That storytelling was the mechanism of preservation. And somewhere in that storytelling, they realized they had a responsibility, not just to remember, but to warn. Today, we stand in a world saturated with information, yet still haunted by the same threats. The sky has not changed. Meteors still drift through space, comets still shed debris, and our cities, like theirs, are vulnerable. What we inherit from the Sumerians is not just their fear, but their resolve, their determination to turn grief into instruction, ash into story, ruins into warnings. Clay tablets are not just artifacts, they are acts of resistance. Resistance against forgetting, resistance against the erasure of suffering. The mother who looked away from her daughter, the father who turned from his son, these are not characters, they were people. And someone remembered them. Someone pressed their story into clay so that 4,000 years later, we could hear their echo. And now we must ask ourselves, what stories are we preserving? What warnings are we passing forward? When the next catastrophe comes, and it will our words endure? Will our grief be remembered? Or will we be dust without testimony? Silence without witness? The scribes of ancient Mesopotamia have shown us the way. They bore witness. They wrote through tears. They believed that memory mattered, that story could outlive flame, that future generations, us, might read their words and understand. And in that understanding, maybe, just maybe, the fire would not fall again. Tal el Hammam is not just a ruin in the Jordan Valley. It is a message carved into the bones of history. Its ash, its melted walls, its scattered bones, and salt-saturated soil form a kind of letter, addressed not to its contemporaries, but to us. It says, in effect, this happened. It was real. It could happen again. And if the events that unfolded there over 3,600 years ago truly echo the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, then we must confront the possibility that the ancient texts we inherited are more than stories. They are memory. They are warning. Civilizations like to believe they are eternal. We build monuments, systems, and ideologies meant to last forever. But history tells a different story. Cities fall, empires crumble, languages vanish. The evidence uncovered at Tal el-Hammam does not suggest a slow decline. It reveals a moment of violence so extreme that it burned the memory of a place into the very geology of the region. 1 second, a thriving city of 8,000 people stood, complete with palaces, markets, and temples. The next, it was gone. Not conquered, not decayed, gone. The archaeological data is undeniable. The destruction layer is thick, uniform, and filled with debris that cannot be explained by any known Bronze Age event. Pottery melted, roofs vaporized, human remains shattered and disarticulated. It wasn't war, it wasn't famine, it was something else, something fast and total. Forensic analysis shows injuries consistent with explosive trauma. Not combat. The melted materials require temperatures over 2,000 degrees Celsius, far beyond what any ancient fire could produce. The pattern of debris shows force from above and in a specific direction. The layer of salt covering the site is unnatural, suggesting airborne brine deposited by a violent atmospheric event. And that leads us back to the skies, a Tunguska-style airburst, caused by a cosmic object exploding mid-air, fits the evidence almost perfectly. If such an object detonated above Tal el-Hammam, the resulting heat and shockwave could have liquefied pottery, fragmented buildings, salted the earth, and killed thousands in seconds. The resemblance to the biblical narrative is uncanny. Fire from heaven, smoke like a furnace. A land left desolate, a woman turned to salt, survivors fleeing to a small town that was spared. It reads like metaphor until it starts to look like a field report. But this event did not go unremembered. The Sumerian scribes documented similar citywide destruction, though filtered through the lens of their theology. The era epic speaks of 7 weapons. The laments speak of evil winds, fire on rooftops, divine regret. The Hebrew scriptures speak of judgment, of angels, of cities so sinful that only one family was worth saving. Different voices, different languages, one story. And that story, if read carefully, is not one of vengeance but of vulnerability. The people of Sodom and the citizens of Ur and the children of Tal el-Hammam had no idea they stood on the edge of history. They lived their lives. They built their homes. They believed, as we often do, that tomorrow would be like today, and then everything ended. This is the deeper message of these ancient accounts. Human life is fragile. Cities are fragile. Even civilizations are not guaranteed permanence. The ancients understood this in a way we often do not. They watched everything they loved vanish in moments, and they had only one tool left: memory. And so they wrote. They wrote not to entertain, but to preserve, not to glorify, but to warn. The clay tablets and biblical verses are not simply literature. They are memorials. They are shrines to the dead, built not of stone, but of language. And when we read them, we become participants in that act of remembrance. This is why interpretation matters. If we reduce Genesis to myth, we miss its archaeological accuracy. If we dismiss the Sumerian laments as poetry, we ignore their forensic value. But if we read them as cultural trauma responses, deep memory encoded in symbol and theology, we can begin to see the outlines of a real event. An event so terrifying, so total, that it echoed across nations and centuries. And in that echo, there is a lesson. Because we are no less vulnerable today than they were. Our cities are larger, our tools more complex, our communications faster. But our survival is still subject to nature, to the cosmos, to probabilities we cannot fully control. The fire from heaven could come again, not because of sin, but because of orbit. The same sky that once shattered Tal el-Hammam still watches over us. NASA now tracks near-Earth objects. Telescopes scan the dark. Warning systems exist, but they are not perfect. Most of the objects large enough to cause regional damage remain undetected. We live in a lull between impacts, a window of calm that we mistake for safety. But statistically, the next airburst is not an if, it is a when. And so, the question becomes, will we remember? Will we listen to the warnings carved in clay, buried in ruins, preserved in scripture? Or will we turn away, comfortable in our assumptions, convinced that catastrophe belongs to the past? The people of Sodom didn't know they were in a story. The scribes of didn't know their laments would outlast their cities, but they wrote anyway. They bore witness. They pressed sorrow into clay so that someone, someday, would understand. That someone is us. As we study Tal el-Hammam, as we connect it to Genesis, to Sumer, to the global echoes of skyborne fire, we find not just a narrative, but a responsibility to remember, to prepare, to honor those who came before by ensuring that their suffering teaches something. And that, perhaps, is the most sacred legacy of all. The gods of Sumer are gone, the temples are dust, the scribes are nameless, but their words endure. The mother looked away from her daughter, the people moaned. The fire came down, and someone survived to write it down. That is what matters. That is what lasts. And that is the warning from the ashes.